What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 157. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today I'm joined by Connor Freeman. He's a writer at the Libertarian Institute, and of course, I'm sure everybody recognizes him because he is the most frequent guest on the show. So, Connor, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Kyle. Thanks for having me back on.
Excited to have you back on. We got some Iran news and actually quite buildup of it because we didn't get to it last week. Of course, stuff on Afghanistan, but we want to look ahead here too to what's also going on like in China and the U.S. great power rivalry. And as we wrap up one conflict in the Middle East, the war state isn't just going to take the loss to their profits. They're going to look for some other places to escalate. So share the show. We are on the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show and the daily news roundup that I write. You can follow the show on Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. The Twitter handle is @con_interest. You can check out the video version of the show on YouTube, Odyssey, or Rumble. Wherever you're watching, just be sure to hit the like button, hit the share button. Make sure more people are looking at this. Again, we've had some great past month or two on conflicts of interest. We've really built a decent portion of our audience up, but help us to keep the momentum and be sure to share the show. And the last thing you do to help out the show is get your CBD products at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com has a great lineup of products. My personal favorite is their topical sports cream. Absolutely excellent for muscle or back pain, works very quickly. But they also have other products that do other great things like take the edge off with anxiety. One or two of their gummies are perfect for that. They have the Ed Strat, so you could do a couple drops under your tongue. They also have a great mint flavored Ed Strat, so not only is it nice for taking a little bit of an edge off, but it also freshens up your breath and just makes you feel like you had like a nice brush your teeth lately. So check out everything they got over at Paloma Verde. Just be sure to use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. That'll save you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. All right, Connor, let's get into it, and we're going to start off today talking about Iran, and Israel has been making a lot of threats, so I don't know which one you want to start on first, but go ahead and let's just get into the threats that Israel has been making and the American officials they're meeting with.
Absolutely. So last week we had Naftali Bennett, the new prime minister of Israel, who replaced Netanyahu, come to D.C. for his first visit to D.C. And so he met with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Lloyd Austin, Pentagon chief, and then Joe Biden. He was supposed to meet with Joe Biden last Thursday, but of course the meeting was moved because of everything going on in Afghanistan with the attack outside Kabul airport. So now actually we've seen some of the reporting coming out about what's been going on. And since you mentioned the threats, I'll just say that in advance of the meetings, Bennett was speaking to the New York Times, and he was saying essentially that he was going to present Biden with a new strategy for how to deal with Iran that would not include a U.S. return to the Iran deal, to the JCPOA. And he talked about how he would step up and continue the covert attacks inside Iran, including what he called the gray area stuff. And he also said that, among other things, that they would build up alliances with the Gulf states to essentially to counter, as they put it, Iranian aggression. But this is really more about aggression against Iran. And also we saw that he was already basically saying that, even ahead of the meeting, because we know that the Biden administration has expressed some displeasure about the continuing settlement expansion in the West Bank, and what's been going on in Palestine. They said they're not going to make any peace deals with the Palestinians. They're not entertaining that, and they're going to continue the settlements. So getting into the actual meetings, Austin met with Bennett. Oh yeah, so we'll get to the So Austin met with Bennett, and he said Austin came out and said he was personally committed to deepening their security relationship with Israel. He said that commitment is steadfast and ironclad. He reaffirmed the U.S. policy supporting Israel's qualitative military edge, their ability to unequivocally dominate any states in the region. He explicitly said that the reason they're doing this is because of the threat from Iran, as well as their proxies and their terrorist groups. He said,
Connor,
Iran.
can I just add a little bit there, because I think this is really important, because the Biden administration has agreed to move forward with that $20+ billion weapon sale to the UAE. That I believe includes Predator drones and F-35s and all of that. And the quantitative military edge program calls for them to have superior weaponry, not only to, Iran or whoever the enemy in the Middle East is, but any state in the Middle East. And so Israel has already, during the Trump administration, they were using that weapon sale to try to get more advanced U.S. weapons. And interesting that the Biden administration is moving forward with the same exact Trump policy now, even though there was a month or two where it was ambiguous, because they did freeze that agreement once they took over, but then they ended up unfreezing it.
No, absolutely. In fact, yeah, no. So but when Biden came in, of course, he's continued the genocide in Yemen, but he was making all kinds of promises he didn't follow through about how I'm going to, what did he say? Stop all relevant arms sales. Yeah, offensive military operations, and was it relevant arms sales to those and so they froze that sale to the UAE for a minute, like you said, and then they let it go through. And the fact is, I remember Ted Snyder, I think, writing about this last year. I think I cited him in a nice block quote in one of my pieces from last year about Iran, where he was talking about how they were supporting the sales to the UAE, and then saying, well, you got to give us these bunker buster bombs, to keep up the QME. But as he pointed out, this was, after the attacks on Natanz in the summer, because there was this extensive sabotage campaign against Iran, all kinds of infrastructure. Some of it, was Israel, it's ambiguous on other things, but attacks on like hospitals and ports and things like that. But they did attack the Natanz facility to the point where the Iranians had to make significant renovations to it and build, they had to essentially, I think, move some of the facility even further underground. And so the Israelis were lobbying the U.S. for these. And I think even Congress was supporting this, which, sounds about right. But essentially, they were looking for these bunker buster bombs so that they could attack the Natanz facility if they chose to. So Austin is saying that's he's reaffirming the support for that's an American policy, the QME, the qualitative military edge for Israel, with all of our military aid. It's nearly $4 billion a year. He says Iran must be held accountable for aggression in the Middle East and on international waters. Referencing, we covered, I think, 2 shows ago on those incidents in the ships, including the Mercer Street tanker, an Israeli-linked tanker near Oman, where I believe it was a Romanian and a British national who were killed. Iran has been accused of this by the British, the Americans, the Israelis most notably. And they were, the Israelis were calling for actually to attack. They were saying we may just attack them ourselves, but essentially they wanted some sort of international coalition to attack Iran. But of course, the Iranians, I think is, I'm blanking on their foreign ministry spokesman's name, but he was great throughout that whole incident, because he kept coming out and saying, look, if you have evidence, why don't you present it? And they never really did. In fact, Dave DeCamp covered on this show a few episodes ago just how questionable the evidence that CENTCOM produced was. They showed a picture of something that looked like a suicide drone, and then they go, it's basically busted to hell, and there was hardly anything left, and they go, well, the fin of this resembles something we've seen put out by Iran before, and so therefore it must be Iran. And it was, extremely, they didn't really prove anything.
They found 2 similar 90-degree pieces of bent metal and claimed that was proof of the attack. Something, just to take a quick detour and talk about this, the Mercer Street incident. Something we were just talking about before the show, Connor, is this is such a great example of how the war state launders their news to create their narrative, where they reported on this in somewhat in the mainstream up until the point where the U.S. would actually have to present evidence and like have an actual debate. Did Iran actually do this or not? This is what we have for evidence. This is their counter arguments. And right when that happens, suddenly it's lost in the news cycle and nobody talks about it. And so now when you brought this up to me, you say, Lloyd Austin will say that the Mercer Street happened and that's why we had to be aggressive against Iran. Everybody just has to go along with it and kind of nods their heads, because the last time they heard about the Mercer Street, everybody was pointing the finger at Iran, and well, nobody covered it since to say that Iran didn't do it. So, I'm sure General Austin's right.
Yeah, exactly. And we see this a lot with, the accusations and I think an advisor to Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister of Russia, brought this up recently. It's nothing really particularly new, but I always thought it was notable that this guy just came out and said it, that essentially the U.S. is waging a new psychological war, sort of a mind war, by throwing out all these myriad unproven allegations, and then just kind of, in a sort of a Goebbels-esque way, you just keep repeating a big lie again and again and again. You don't have to prove, as far as I'm concerned, if you don't prove it, it's a lie. Especially on this, on the international stage, you're accusing another state of attacking and killing people, and then using that to justify. Well, if we were not returning to the Iran deal and they were making all kinds of threats, we're going to get to that more. The Iranians are saying, Biden illegally threatened Iran in this meeting with Naftali Bennett. But essentially, we're killing people with our sanctions. So, it's justified the whole point of, the whole sanctions regime on Iran is based on the idea that they're racing toward a bomb, which is something we always hear, but we're even hearing now more and more as the Israelis especially attempt to thwart any return to the JCPOA. And that is just simply not true, and it's never been true. But the statistics, Daniel Larison wrote a piece a little while ago about some statistics that came out that showed that you know what? I'm going to blank on the exact numbers.
It's a majority of Americans that believe Iran has a nuclear weapon, and there's nowhere near a majority that think that Israel does. And of course, Israel has the nuke and Iran doesn't. Connor, but let's move back to this, and keeps talking about these threats. So at the meeting between Biden and Bennett, I was almost surprised that it wasn't a news story at all, that meeting got bumped. I just felt like Bennett would have been a little ticked about it, but I guess maybe it was a big enough story, and nobody really covered the fact that it got bumped. It just kind of like happened, and so I guess there wasn't really a PR issue with it. And if anybody remembers that meeting at all, I think, Connor, other than me, you, and the people who comment on foreign policy, it's that 20-second clip where it looks like Biden dozes off, which in a way I kind of want to make a big deal out of, because I think it's great to undermine the U.S.-Israel relationship, and this would be a way. Look, and if Biden did that to Bennett, Israel, when the U.S. was trying to restart talks with Iran, they were doing all these covert measures, and they hit the Iranian ship in the Red Sea and stuff like that, like 2 days after the U.S. said they were going to engage in direct talks with Iran. So maybe Biden did it on purpose. That would be a pretty, it's a grandpa move, but it's a pretty awesome grandpa move to doze off intentionally when you're having a very public meeting with somebody. But go ahead and tell us the actual important details of this meeting.
Sure. And I'll just add my reaction to that when I first saw it was like, Biden has been known for decades as Israel's man in Washington, and this is so formulaic, the things that he said. Really, this was part of a PR campaign. If you read like Phil Weiss and Mondo Weiss, they're trying to – a big aspect of this was because there were no concessions made over on the Palestinian issue. So to try and because Democrats are becoming increasingly, especially post-Trump, Trump kind of made the Israel issue almost a more of a partisan issue than it have been in the past. So it made it more difficult for, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter and all the attacks on Gaza, especially like even last May. We're seeing more and more. We're going to talk about that, statistics of people wanting to condition aid to Israel and all kinds of things, especially Democrats. And so a big part of this, you'll keep hearing things like they'll say, oh, Naftali Bennett keeps coming out and going, oh, Biden and I were really good friends, close friends, very close friends. I feel like I've known him forever. That was just a great meeting, and we just hit it off. And they're trying to sell this idea that but Joe likes him, so don't you, Democrats? Come on, get with the program. So it was so funny because he could do those talking points himself, so it probably did put him to sleep. But so anyway, so Biden said while he was talking to Bennett, he goes, the threat. He's speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, and he says, the threat from Iran and our commitment to ensure he said that we discussed the threat from Iran and our commitment to ensure Iran never develops a nuclear weapon. And this is for people who want to check it, Middle East Eye. Biden tells Israel's Bennett there are other options if nuclear talks fail. And he says, we're putting diplomacy first. We'll see where that takes us. But if diplomacy fails, we're ready to turn to other options. He said, without offering specifics. And then Bennett said, I was happy to hear your clear words that Iran will never be able to acquire a nuclear weapon, and that you emphasize that you will try the diplomatic route, but there's other options if it doesn't work out. And so Bennett has promised, they mentioned that any objections he has to the nuclear deal will be discussed privately with the White House in a bid to repair strained ties with the Democratic Party. Like I was leading to earlier, maintain a more bipartisan position with his closest ally. But it's so ironic because, look at all this coverage. It's not exactly quiet what they're doing. So other notes from the meeting. Let's see. Biden said. So there's that report from Axios as well about the death by 1,000 cuts Iran strategy, where they say that these are Israeli officials speaking to Axios, and they say that they're giving you some of it seems like they're trying to sort of box the Americans in to some extent, because they're just anonymous Israeli officials. But I thought this was a notable report, and they say. But at the same time, it gets us a little bit of insight into what was going on behind, in the actual meeting itself. And they say. The main goal was lobbying the U.S. not to return to the JCPOA. Bennett came to express urgency about how close Iran is getting to the bomb. The Israelis, Bennett presents, he wants the strategy to be, as they characterize it, small actions across a number of fronts, military and diplomatic, instead of a single dramatic strike. And he framed the situation, this is ridiculous, as it's kind of like your Cold War with the Soviet Union. Iran is the Soviet Union of the region, and America, of course, Israel is, of course, the America of the Middle East. And he goes, it's ironic that he said that because actually the whole anti-Iran push, because they were allies for decades and maintained a covert relationship. Through the Iran-Iraq War and into the early 90s, it wasn't until the actual end of the Cold War, as Scott Horton explains in Enough Already, that they switched sides essentially because they had to find, as Trita Parsi talks about in Treacherous Alliance, he quotes, I forget exactly what official or who he quotes, but the line I always remember is they needed new glue for the alliance. Now that Saddam had been smashed and that the communist Soviet Union no longer existed, how do we justify all this aid and this special relationship? So they settled on this PR campaign against radical Islam, really focusing on Iran. And they used Martin Indyk and the Clinton administration, and that's the whole dual containment strategy of Iran and Iraq that largely led to 9/11 as far as what motivated the Al-Qaeda attacks. And so he lobbied the U.S. also to stay in Syria and Iraq, which I thought was very interesting. And they said that we want to put Iran's aggression back in a box, regional aggression as well as its nuclear program. I think they said back in the box. And a big part of that, of course, is they want the Americans, presumably indefinitely, to stay in Syria and Iraq. And the Israeli officials who are talking to Axios, they say they're very optimistic after post the meeting, as far as they're, they think Biden is very they think Biden will go along with that, basically, which is, totally lines up with all the reporting we've been seeing about the policy. Really nominal changes on Iraq. It's no longer combat; it's an advisory mission. Are you withdrawing any troops? No. And Syria, even though he doesn't seem to know we have troops there, or maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but we certainly have. It's very clear that we are not leaving Syria. We're going to continue to occupy the country.
All right.
The Northeast anyway.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what Israel wants probably aligns with what the U.S. was going to do anyways. I don't think Biden was ever going to leave Syria, regardless of what Israel wanted or not. But there's an interesting statement made by the Iranians that I thought was pretty important to point out, and something that I've been yelling about on this show for, 8 months now. And that is the Iranians say that, hey, it seems like the Biden policy is awful similar to the Trump policy. And that's a real issue for them because, Trump undid what Obama had done to, build some diplomacy with Iran. And now if Biden is continuing down the Trump path, that means that this is a path towards conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said on Saturday, let's see, I've got the quotes. He says, America's current administration is no different from the previous one because what it demands from Iran on the nuclear issue is different in words, but the same thing that Trump demanded. Khamenei said, this is from his official website. The Americans truly have no shame on the nuclear issue. And even though they withdrew from the JCPOA, they now talk in a way and make demands as if it were Iran that withdrew. And he also says, behind the scenes of America's foreign policy, there is a predator wolf that sometimes changes to a cunning fox. And I think, the Ayatollah has been saying, we've been hearing, quotes from him for a few weeks now about, as Raisi comes in and sort of forms his new government, he's framed as being this hardliner, and the sort of the rhetoric from the think tank, the anti-Iranian hardliners here in this country, and also the Israelis as well, is the idea that you can't negotiate with this guy. He's a hardliner, he executed all these MEK people at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. He was involved in those commissions when he was a judge.
Which is kind of ironic here because I learned this week that Naftali Bennett was involved in the Quantum Massacre, the first one. He was actually a commander that I don't know how involved he was in picking the actual target, but he did, say that his troops were under fire and they needed support. That led to I think a UN shelter being shelled and 100+ mostly kids being killed, and this being the kind of thing that radicalized, I believe, some of the 9/11 hijackers. And so, just to point out that Rossi might not be a good guy, but people talked about Trump sitting down with killers. I don't know if Putin has killed as many people as Naftali Bennett, and he certainly hasn't said that he enjoys killing Arabs, and Bennett has. So that's quite a terrible figure that Biden sat down with. But go ahead, Connor.
No, absolutely. And again, I read a piece from Moon of Alabama about that, and about the what they're saying about Rossi and his, what do they call them, death commissions or something like that. And it sounds like the majority. Okay, I'm not defending the guy, but the majority of the people apparently who were killed in these things. This is at the. I thought there was something weird about that because, the time matches up with the tail end of the Iran-Iraq war, where the U.S. was, backing Israel, backing Iran, and also, Israel, who was covertly backing Iran, and then America, of course, and their Gulf allies were, arming and supporting Iraq. And they were launching chemical weapons attacks with satellite information and, assistance from the U.S. intelligence. Chemical weapons attacks that killed tens of thousands of Iranian conscripts. And so, 500,000 people died on both sides of that war. So, and the MEK, of course, were launching attacks against Iran during that war from Iraq. So, I mean, what happened essentially was that it sounds like there was some sort of a campaign where the MEK went into Iran and started attacking at the end of the war, and a lot of these people were rounded up, and I think they basically a lot of them were killed. But again, this is in the middle of this is a result largely, you could say, of U.S. foreign policy, and also, I mean, yeah. So it's more nuanced, I would say, than bombing a UN shelter full of women and children in the
And
middle of your war on in southern
I,
Lebanon.
and I mean, if that's what we're talking about here, we had to remember that after the Islamic State, was defeated in Iraq, they were at sentencing women who were, allegedly married to Islamic State fighters, in groups of like 15 or 20 to death. I'm not sure how many of those people got executed, but they were being sentenced to death in these like mass trial situations, and so, I mean, the U.S. was backing that government and absolutely okay with it. Not that that makes it right. It just makes it something that it isn't a uniquely one-time event that we should be outraged about it, and we can't deal with this because obviously we can and do all the time.
Exactly, and so they're using this as against Rossi, and they're saying that oh, you can't trust him. He can't be reasoned with. Is kind of what they usually say about what the hardliners. They don't treat the moderates any better. Usually, I mean, we saw what happened here with Rouhani. I think he said his quote on the way out was that the Americans essentially stole the opportunity from my government to essentially give Iran the benefits, the people the benefits of normalizing relations with the West. And I'm paraphrasing, but yeah. So I mean, they're kind of selling this as he's just the worst, and you can't talk to him. And so we're now seeing, the Biden administration saying that. Well, but actually, what we find out is that they're the ones who are saying you have to put a sentence now. You can't. The whole thing was if the U.S. lifts sanctions, the Iranians would return to their compliance with the deal. The Iranians never left the deal. Under Articles 26 and 36, they're well within their rights to do the things they're doing, even enriching uranium to 60%. It's legal at least under the Safeguards Agreement, and it's under the supervision of the IAEA, as well as they're not violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty. 60%, they don't really have any use for that. They most likely dilute it back to usable level after that, after they make the point. But yeah, I mean, the Americans are the ones who are putting in all the. Basically, they're saying if you don't, and we saw this coming really in the reporting as Biden was coming into office. We were talking about on the show, and we were hearing comments from Sullivan about how regional activities and ballistic missiles have to be on the table for Reed Zakaria. They just do. And, and it's just like, I mean, it was being reported by, I think, even Scott Ritter at the time that Blinken was saying things like that they were inserting all kinds of poison pills that were going to make it nearly impossible for a return to the deal. And we come to find out the Ayatollah has been saying that, yeah, they're trying to insert this sentence that says, if we return to the deal, you have to basically submit to negotiating on these other issues, and if you don't, we can then just say that you violated the deal and then put the sanctions back on. And of course they won't even offer the verification mechanism to guarantee sanctions relief, and they won't provide a guarantee, not necessarily that they can, but that they won't guarantee that they won't leave the deal again like Trump did. And so, of course, the Iranians are in a very difficult position dealing with a dishonest actor like the Americans here. So then also, the Iranians came out, the Secretary General of the National Security Council, and said after Biden said that stuff about, there are other options we will pursue if diplomacy fails. And he said the emphasis on using other options against Iran amounts to threatening another country illegally and establishes Iran's right to reciprocate against so-called available options. And yeah, so we've seen also just in leading up to these meetings with Bennett, we've been getting quotes from, Aviv Kohavi, the hawkish chief of staff of the IDF, saying to reporters that they're speeding up operational plans against Iran. He says that the new military budget, which is bigger, has funds to expand capabilities against Iran. Benny Gantz issued a similar threat, saying the state of Israel has means to act and will not hesitate to do so. I do not rule out the possibility that Israel will have to take action in the future in order to prevent a nuclear Iran. And he also says he's sort of trying to box Biden in, Gantz is saying to the media, according to the Times of Israel, the United States and Israel share intelligence information and the cooperation with the United States in this field, and it is only getting stronger. We are working with them in order to establish a plan B to demonstrate that if there is no deal, other activities will begin, as President Biden said. And that's what Gantz said. So it seems to me like they're trying to sort of, at least on some level, push the Americans into, kind of like where, well, you said this, and I could see the Republicans making use of that. We saw even during the slaughter in Gaza in May, Rubio going to he sent a letter to the White House demanding just and no sanctions relief and no more talks with Iran, even these indirect talks that were going on in Vienna. Using this attack on Gaza, a concentration camp, people are under blockade, as a way to thwart talks with Iran. That's what Marco Rubio, how he exploited that situation.
Right. So, Connor, is there anything else going on with the possibility of TOTS here? Any potential good news that you have for us that, hey, maybe TOTS will get restarted here, the Indrad TOTS? I know it's going to be an uphill battle for a ton of reasons if they do get restarted, but is there any plans or hopes that they might in the coming days or weeks?
Well, I sincerely hope so. I don't really have any good news on that front. It seems to me like, the French, and I will say this, the French and the Germans are saying to the Iranians, you should come back and do talks right now. Although what's interesting is, the Iranians made huge concessions even to do these indirect talks because there was no sanctions relief, which means that Trump launched the maximum pressure campaign and essentially said, you better talk with us. We're not lifting sanctions until you do. And they thought they would wait it out until Biden came into office because surely he'd be more reasonable. But ultimately, they conceded to those terms, basically, and came to the negotiation table without any sanctions relief or any concessions. In fact, Biden added sanctions. But I will say this: the Germans and the French are saying you need to come back to the negotiating table. Although I believe it's the new foreign minister who said, "All right, look, everybody knows this. It takes like 2 to 3 months for us to get our thing together. It takes for a new administration to sort of get settled." And then they made a comment. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, the foreign minister said, "We are not seeking to flee the negotiation table, and the government considers a real negotiation as a negotiation that produces palpable results, allowing the rights of the Iranian nation to be guaranteed." And this is Amir Abdollahian, the new foreign minister. And the foreign ministry of Germany said they're vehemently urging Iran to resume talks, and the French foreign minister said he's urging an immediate resumption of negotiations. As far as that, I'll just say that the French, the Germans, and the British issued a joint statement a little while ago, back last month, basically saying they're gravely concerned about, what they think amounts to serious violations of the deal on the part of Iran. But Jason Ditz at antiwar.com debunked all this. They're basically talking about they configured 2 new centrifuge cascades at the Natanz facility to produce or to enrich uranium hexafluoride to 60%. But I already explained that's essentially that's basically a negotiating tactic. It was pushed by the Iranian parliament after the Israelis attacked the Natanz nuclear facility at the start of the Vienna talks back in April. And then also they're accusing them of, just like the Americans, Ned Price is coming out and going, they have no use for uranium metal. And they're saying, you see these reports where even the IAEA is kind of, as Jason says, they kind of cause these sort of controversies because they put out these reports that are treated with such alarmism when these are things that Iran already announced and is already doing under IAEA supervision. But they're just saying that the fact that they're taking uranium and enriching it to 20% to make those it's uranium tetrafluoride that they enrich to 20% enriched uranium, and then they convert those into fuel plates for the Tehran Medical Research Reactor, which is a U.S. built reactor that the Americans built back when the Shah, the American puppet dictator, was ruling Iran. And the reason they're doing that is because they're supposed to be able to get fuel from other states, but since Trump left the deal and reimposed sanctions, they've made it impossible for them to do that. In fact, that reactor is outmoded. They wanted to replace it with a new heavy water reactor design, but again, the sanctions are making that nearly impossible. So it's just interesting that you see kind of the Europeans not really pressing the US to come back to their commitments, but hyping up the threat of the Iranian nuclear program. So I don't know. I mean, you see, well, I will say this on the regional front, some things look good because Iran and Saudi are talking to each other now again. So it seems like they're getting ready to do a fourth round of talks. So since April, they've had like sort of 3 negotiations, I believe maybe it's not in Baghdad. It's being done through Iraq. So yeah, Dave DeCamp reported on this at antiwar.com the other day. The ambassador in Iraq, Iran's ambassador, said we have had 3 rounds of negotiations with the Saudi side, and the 4th round is to be held after the formation of a new Iranian government. And Dave says that starting in April, they've been holding the negotiations in Baghdad that have been on hold as Raisi's creating the new government. And he also talks about, of course, Soleimani was assassinated in that U.S. drone strike at the beginning of 2020 during the Trump administration, that we nearly went to war with Iran if they hadn't have been so restrained, the Iranians, that is. But he was on a diplomatic mission, actually, I believe meeting with the former prime minister of Iraq, who was facilitating talks, as Dave says here, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So, but I mean, the Saudis seem to be concerned. That's actually a good thing, that them actually realizing that if it does look like the U.S. is removing some troops from the region, and as he says here, the Patriot anti-missile batteries out of Saudi and other Gulf states, that it makes sense if they can't rely on the U.S. to do their fighting for them, and to be the hegemon here. Then they should actually have some talks with their longtime rival and try and figure something out. But throwing a monkey wrench into that, you have the Israelis in the media now. They're suggesting, and you've been seeing a lot of this from people like Elliot Abrams in the press as well. Philip Weiss was talking about this in one of his articles. The talk now is that Israel should form some sort of like a Middle East kind of anti-Iran NATO equivalent with the Gulf states, as they say, as the Israelis say, the reasonable Arab nations, to counter Iranian domination and aggression. So they're looking at, let's see. So Bennett is, they're saying let's see. A reporter with Israel's public broadcaster Khan said Bennett's idea would form a military alliance between Israel, Jordan, and the Gulf states to confront Iran. This would include the installation of radars and warning devices to counter any threat from Iran. And that's a quote from the report. And this is, again, Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, Israeli media. But yeah, Bennett suggested NATO-style alliance against Iran. So I think they're trying to combat that. In fact, Raisi said one of his priorities coming in as the new president was to mend relations with the Gulf states. And we're also seeing that that's a priority of Bennett, is to deepen cooperation with the Gulf states. And the infrastructure is kind of already in place if you look at the Abraham Accords. I know Dave DeCamp has said that as the U.S. gradually focuses more on great power competition and starts to really move ahead on the Asia pivot, they seem to be wanting something like that, where you can have sort of a regional ally take more responsibility and have a situation like the Abraham Accords, where they can just sort of U.S. proxies kind of do their work for them. But it's that's a slow process, and I don't know how exactly that would all work out. I think it would be obviously not a good idea, but of course, Israel relies so much on U.S. aid for and diplomatic and political cover. And just the substantial, I mean, they're the biggest recipient of foreign military aid. So it's like, the idea that they're taking we'll shoulder some more responsibility. It's still all, I don't see us leaving the region anytime soon. And I think it's still going to be, this is all on our dime essentially. And so I don't know. As to answer your question, I don't know if I see any silver lining here yet.
So as well as talking about Iran at that meeting, there is also discussion. I think that's more Israeli centric. Although I don't think there was any discussion of the Palestinians. I believe I read that from Mitchell Piltnick at the Quincy Institute had a fantastic article on the meeting. But one thing that did happen at the meeting that I was expecting, because there's a fantastic writer, Grant F. Smith. We publish everything he writes at antiwar.com, and he wrote an article saying like, hey, the US keeps giving Israel this letter, and this letter says that we're not going to recognize your nuclear weapons program, which is important on several levels. One is the US has laws that say we're not supposed to give military aid to countries that are in violation of the non-proliferation treaty, and Israel is in violation of that treaty because they developed nuclear weapons outside of it. And so I was, expecting there to be that letter signed at the meeting, and then we got the report that that letter was signed. And this is so important, Connor, because as you pointed out before, the American people don't know who has nuclear weapons in the Middle East, and this is like one of the most clear examples of an Israel first president signing a secret agreement with a foreign country to allow that foreign country to continue to violate U.S. law. So
yeah,
tell us about this.
I was just reading a piece from Grant Smith about this. He has a really good one called, I believe it's called "Israel's Nukes Make U.S. Aid Illegal," and he talks about these senators. I think it was, I might get one name wrong, but it was John Glenn and I think Stuart Symington, who they amended the foreign assistance laws. Or changed them so that you would have to condition aid to, you can't give aid to a nuclear power that is not a signatory of the non-proliferation treaty. That's illegal. So we've never, since Nixon made the agreement with Golda Meir, they do not ask Israel to sign the NPT, and Israel doesn't declare that they're a nuclear power, but it's an open secret. I mean, they're believed to have obtained nukes for the first time in the 60s. And Grant goes through the whole history of that, about how you had basically Israeli operatives, spies, basically confiscating enough weapons-grade uranium from, I think it's NUMEC, which is a weapons contractor, taking enough weapons-grade uranium to make, I think, a dozen bombs. This would have been back in the 60s with the help of a chemist named Zalman Shapiro. So essentially, Obama made a law, essentially a gag order, that makes it illegal for this to even be acknowledged in FOIA requests. So that's why he shows that document where everything about this is redacted. They've continued on with this agreement. Yeah, and I was just going to say that he makes the point, and it's important to remember, we've given Israel nearly $250 billion in aid. I'm pretty sure that's the qualifications you have to adjust for inflation, but nevertheless, that's absolutely insane when you consider this is a regional power with nuclear weapons. It's perpetually at war. They maintain an open-air concentration camp.
Let's talk about some of the recent Israeli crimes here, Connor. We have Palestinians dying all over the place at the hands of Israeli government employees in one fashion or another. So I'm not sure where you want to start. I know there was somebody was killed in the middle of the night. I believe a 39-year-old man. It's unclear how he was killed. And then there were 2 Palestinians that were shot in a village. So where would be a good place to start here, Connor?
Yeah, well, you know what? I figure, why don't we start with the Human Rights Watch report saying that that Israel committed war crimes in Gaza last May.
Okay.
Because Human Rights Watch is they're not perfect, but they've got a lot. They're a prestigious organization. So when they came out and said, I believe it was earlier this year, along with B'Tselem as well, the top human rights organization, Israel, that Israel is in fact an apartheid state, that was a huge deal. And so now they're coming out and they're saying that Israel made unsubstantiated allegations, where they kept saying, when they were knocking out those towers that housed shops and apartments and foreign and local media offices, that, Hamas has armed personnel in there and they're using them as human shields. that's they're saying that that has not been proven. They have not provided sufficient evidence for that at all. And what this amounts to are war crimes. And as they even quote in here a Palestinian news agency that says no clear reason was seen for the bombing of high rises other than inflicting damage and hurting the population. So these are the Al Jarrah Tower, the Al Jalal Hanandi, and the Al Sharuk Tower, which including, this is a report from Middle East Eye. Middle East Eye had offices there. I mean, notably, they bombed buildings that housed Al Jazeera and the Associated Press as well. So the report says that the airstrikes violated the laws of war and may amount to war crimes. And I thought there were some good quotes here from Richard Weir, who's a crisis and conflict researcher at Human Rights Watch. And he says, the apparently unlawful Israeli strikes on 4 high-rise towers in Gaza City caused serious lasting harm for countless Palestinians who lived, worked, shopped, or benefited from businesses based there. The Israeli military should publicly produce the evidence that it says it relied on to carry out these attacks. He said, as far as those accusations that these are these were military targets because Hamas had human shields there, whatever, with their armed personnel. He says the Human Rights Watch report itself says that they did this repeatedly without providing evidence. And just to remind everybody that more than 250 Palestinians were killed in this, including dozens and dozens of children. I think like nearly 70, and it even says in here that 1,500 economic establishments were destroyed or damaged. They bombed clinics. They bombed roads to hospitals, refugee camps, apartment buildings. They had strikes that hit schools. They hit water supplies. And this is a place that has, most of the water is undrinkable in Gaza because of the blockade. The electricity is extremely unreliable. I think it's like 4 hours out of the day, and you can't really count on when. It's just absolutely horrific conditions. I mean, they've been starving these people virtually just to subsistence level, so that they can't be accused of starving people to the point of malnutrition. But in fact, I think there's a quote from, I don't know if it was a defense minister or not, where they said that we're not starving the Gazans, we're putting them on a diet. And anyway, it's just incredible. The Gaza's Higher Governmental Committee for Reconstruction estimated that the campaign resulted in more than $479 million worth of losses. And also, I think it's important to remember that they destroyed nearly 17,000 homes in that 11-day bombing campaign in Gaza.
And I believe Will Porter, I think it was Will, talked on the show about how there were some Israeli forces that came out afterwards and said that this was, they bombed the towers out of frustration, with just like they weren't able to actually hit any useful Hamas targets. And I'm not quite sure if that is, proven to be the case, or, maybe some pilots said that, maybe that was misreported, but it definitely seems like it could be an investigation into war crimes. Now, what's happening in the West Bank, right? Because that's where some of these raids are still going on.
So we've got, absolutely. Unfortunately, there's a few of these stories. So you've got, what you were saying, there's a report from the Reuters Newswire. Israeli troops shoot dead Palestinian in the West Bank, according to the health minister, the Palestinian Health Ministry. And this is from yesterday. Now, this, to me, based on what we know, I wouldn't say, it's an execution, but you people, I'll just tell you what it says, and you make your own, you decide you interpret it how you want it, but this is all we know so far. Israeli troops shot and killed a Palestinian in the occupied West Bank overnight, Palestinian Health Ministry said on Wednesday. Village residents said there were no disturbances or clashes in the area at the time of the shooting, which occurred near the village of Bet al-Tata, west of the city of Ramallah. The man was returning from work in Israel. He was shot, they said. The residents identified the deceased as a 39-year-old man who lives in the village but carries Jerusalem ID papers, allowing him to cross freely between Israel and the West Bank. The health ministry did not provide further details, and the Israeli military said they were looking into the incident. So, that's essentially all we know at this point, but I don't know. That's not uncommon. For the occupation to just kill people, like you said. They've been stepping up violence in the West Bank quite a bit. If you read Ramsey Baroud, it sounds like they're concerned that there's a a new intifada on the rise, because quite frankly, this whole strategy of dividing up the Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza, since especially the war on Gaza in May, has been kind of well, I mean, there's been a substantial increase in unity amongst the different people there who are putting aside their factionalism and, as Ramsey characterizes it, self-serving, what self-serving political discourses. As he says, the questions are how, where, and when. So he goes through, and I thought we'd talk about this because this is a really great article people should read. It's called "Blood for Blood on Jenin and Israel's Fear of an Armed Palestinian Rebellion." So last week, you and I covered a story about an Israeli raid on this Jenin refugee camp where they shot 8 people and killed 4 young men between the ages of, I think, 19 and 21. And 2 of the bodies were stolen by the Israeli forces and have not been returned. They're using this, this is a common thing, but as he says, it's sort of a bargaining chip to to put psychological pressure on the occupied population there. And so he talks about the history of Jenin, which is sort of synonymous with resistance against the occupation. So this is a refugee camp that has 12,000 people in it now. The camp was really sort of founded in 1953, and it was formed in 1953. This is only a few years, 5 years after the Nakba, the expulsion of about 750,000 Palestinians from historic Palestine, and sort of the creation of the state of Israel in what's called Israel proper today. And so he talks about how these kids were, he goes, they were toddlers or newly born when the Israeli army invaded Jenin in April 2002. And so Ramsey wrote a book about this called Searching Jenin, and he talks about how in the massacre of Jenin, or what's called sometimes the Battle of Jenin, at the end of the battle, Israel seemed to have entirely eliminated the armed resistance of Jenin. Hundreds of fighters and civilians were killed and wounded, hundreds more arrested, and numerous homes destroyed. And he says, based on statements by Israeli officials and army generals, the objective was to teach Jenin a lesson, one they hope would be understood by other resisting Palestinian areas throughout the West Bank. And so he says that essentially that the situation has changed since the war on Gaza, that all these different formerly sort of disparate factions are now coming together and really sort of inspired by the stiff resistance in Gaza. It's had, as he said, a direct impact on the various fighting groups in the West Bank, which had either been disbanded or marginalized, which is why, I don't know. Sometimes they make these accusations and they're not true, but at the same time, there seems to be there is more armed resistance happening in the West Bank against these attacks from the Israeli occupation forces. And so people, especially young men, are starting to shoot back or at least defend themselves when they're attacked
I guess,
in these refugee camps at night.
I guess one way to say it, though, is it seems like this is in response to an Israeli escalation, too. It's not necessarily that, it's just the Palestinians are tired of the same old, same old. The Palestinians are fighting back more as Israel is escalating their aggression against just regular old Palestinians and children and stuff like this.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, listen, 76 children have been killed in Palestine just this year. They've demolished 600 houses in the West Bank and East Jerusalem this year so far, including, I think, nearly 100 in East Jerusalem. We're going to get to this story in a minute. A teenage boy died over the weekend demolishing his neighbor's home, because when they demolish your home because they say, oh, you didn't build it with a permit, they charge or the settlers are taking this land, they charge the Palestinians a fee to have the municipality demolish the home. It's just absolutely disgusting. Absolutely. So I think the numbers 764 people have been injured so far in these different raids that have been going on. 10 people have been killed in Jenin alone this year, including 8 just since the end of the war on Gaza in May. So no, absolutely. I'm just saying that there seems to be some resistance forming.
Right.
Better late than never, and that's frankly good to see. I didn't want to editorialize too much, but it's. Frankly, we're seeing that, as he says, Ramsey says the Israeli military understands that the May war and uprising have triggered an unwelcome transition into Palestinian society. Long suppressed, occupied Palestinians are ready to rebel. They're eager to move on beyond the Abbas and his corrupt clique, past the stifling factionism. The questions are how, where, and when. Precisely why Israel is back in Jenin, once more trying to teach the nearly 12,000 refugees there a lesson, one that is also meant for Palestinians throughout the West Bank. Israel believes that if the nascent armed resistance in Jenin is suppressed now, the rest of the West Bank will remain quiet. And then he cites a Palestinian journalist who talks about like I just said, that 10 of these people have been killed and 8 just since that war in May. And he says that the increased number of casualties among the Palestinians last few months, he says the reason for this, there's 2 main reasons. He says the increased number of Israeli raids where occupation soldiers, who often disguise themselves as Palestinians, enter the camps, refugee camps at night and attempt to capture young Palestinian fighters. And second, the growing number of youth enlisting in various resistance groups. He says the rifles carried by these youth are purchased by the young men themselves as opposed to being supplied by a group or faction. And when they were carrying the 2 young men who were killed, whose bodies weren't stolen by the occupation forces after this raid, when they were murdered, I think 2 weekends ago at this point, he says that they were saying some of the chants were blood for blood, bullet for bullet, fire for fire. And he says the fact is Jenin once more is openly championing the armed struggle option and sending alarm bells through occupied Palestine. And Israel is worried that an armed intifada is in the making, and Abbas knows very well that any kind of intifada would spell doom for his authority. And that's essentially, it sounds like Jenin has a rich history of this kind of resistance. And so this is, as he says, there's sort of the story of Jenin, he says, is kind of it's very much relatable to the rest of the Palestinian struggle, because this is a very unique story as well, and the people of Jenin and their resistance carries a lot of weight with the rest of the occupied population there in the West Bank. So I think that's one reason why we see now, as you said, there was, Bennett is saying, I'm going to continue to expand the settlements. I think there were what was it? I don't remember if they announced it. I think it was thousands of new settlements that were being built recently. I think they reduced the number from like 3,000 something to
it was to like 2,200, and then they also said they were going to let the Palestinians build 1,000 homes, but for some reason, Connor, I think only some of those homes would get built. And then we had 2 more Palestinians killed by the Israelis recently too, right?
That's right. Let's see. So. 2 more. Let's see. I
have.
The boy who was in Gaza. Yes, absolutely. My mistake. So in Jerusalem, yes, this young man, 17-year-old Ali Berkwan. This is the young man I was talking about earlier, who was helping his neighbors demolish their home so that they wouldn't have to pay to demolish their own home. A wall fell in on him and killed him.
Okay.
And so as he says, he says here's some statistics to go over. He says, actually, I already covered some of this stuff. But
right. What about the boy that died at the Gaza protest then?
Oh, well, I'll get to that too, but I just want to say that as they also mentioned this article here at Mondo Weiss that in East Jerusalem, they demolished earlier last month that they demolished a 1-story building that included 4 families, displaced 15 people, which the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that settlers own the land on which the houses were built. And of course, this is just a completely rigged apartheid system. And you have, the families were given 20 days to evacuate their homes. They disputed the decision, according to the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, saying they bought the home back in 1952. As well, in mid-August, an elderly Palestinian man from Bet Hanina had a stroke after an Israeli court ruled in favor of Jewish settlers, transferring the rights to his home to a settler organization and forced his family to destroy their home. So then, as far as Gaza goes, yes, there's a young man who's either 13 or 12. They're sort of differing. It sort of differs in the different reports, but he was shot in the neck, in the front of the neck, and went through the back of his neck maybe by that sniper who died recently after he was shot by after he was that guy was shooting at children. We covered this last week.
Right.
It might have been that same guy. But yeah, so no, this young man was named Abu al-Nil, and he died. He succumbed to the gunshot wounds that he was from back during the protest. He died on August 21st. And they say that he was hundreds of feet away from the perimeter fence, observing the demonstrations. This is what the DCIP, which is I want to make sure I get the acronym right. It's the Defense for Children International Palestine. They reported that, yes, he was 70 to 100 meters away from the perimeter fence observing the demonstrations when Israeli forces shot him in the throat, essentially. At 5:30 p.m. He lost conscious instantly. An eyewitness told DCIP the bullet entered the front side of his neck and exited the back side, damaging his windpipe and carotid artery and stopping his heart. He was in the ICU for a week until he succumbed to his wounds. He's the 73rd Palestinian child to be killed by Israel since the start of 2021.
Wow. Well, absolutely horrific, Connor.
They bombed Gaza this week as well.
Right. I was going
Sunday.
Gonna ask about that too. There was also bombs dropped on Gaza. They claim it was because of Hamas, but it seems like dropping bombs because somebody sent a balloon with something flaming on it over a wall and started a little brush fire is a little absurd. But is that exactly what happened here?
That's essentially. I mean, this is again from the news wire on Reuters, and yeah, I mean. They say this every time they do this. They go, "Oh, we're bombing tunnels and we're bombing weapons manufacturing facilities, whatever." But yeah, they claim that in the middle of the night, people were hurling explosives and burning tires. That's what the Israeli military said. And always keep in mind, this is a concentration camp essentially. So, and yeah, I mean, like what I mean, and again, there's no casualties on the other side. I mean, at the worst, they say that you started some brush fires in some fields or something. Usually, when they're talking about these so-called incendiary balloons. But yeah, no, they bombed Gaza. Although there were no casualties reported in the bombings in Gaza, they did say that the military responded to these people who gathered along what they call the frontier. During the night that I mentioned earlier. They say they responded with riot dispersal means, and Gaza medics said at least 6 Palestinians were hurt, one seriously. And then a few hours later, they launched airstrikes in a pre-dawn attack.
All right. Well, I mean, Connor, this is all bad news for the people in, Palestine and Gaza particularly. But maybe a little bit of like sunshine on the horizon, where I saw 50% of Americans now support conditioning aid to Israel. Now, I'm not so sure if you told them that, Israel wouldn't meet any of those conditions, so that this would mean cutting aid to Israel. But this is definitely a huge step in the right direction. So what's going on here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so we've got from 2021, the Chicago Council survey found 50% of Americans want the U.S. to restrict military aid to Israel. It showed a majority of Democrats want that aid restricted. So it's split. It's interesting because it's split right down partisan lines, and it's almost virtually the opposite. So 62% of Democrats think Israel should prohibit its use in military operations against Palestinians. 32% are opposed to the idea. While Republicans... in the case of Republicans, 32% are in favor of restricting aid, and 61% oppose those measures. So they also talk about how the study shows that 56% of Americans said an independent Palestinian state, sort of along the lines of a legitimate version of the two-state solution, an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza, was acceptable. But 60%, I think it's interesting that they frame it this way, a one-state solution in which Israelis and Palestinians are treated as equal citizens was acceptable. Because if you said that to the American people, who, generally speaking, I would hope that if it was more clear to them what was going on vis-a-vis who's occupying who there and what the reality of the situation is on the ground, that Americans would oppose it. So when it is, presented to them like that, well, how about equal rights for both Israelis and Palestinians? Of course the American people are going to support that. You know what I mean? And this is, as they say, part and parcel with some other figures and polls we've been seeing this year. There was a Gallup poll in March that said a majority of Democrats believe the U.S. should be exerting pressure on Israel, not Palestine. A Jewish Electorate Institute poll, this is This one made the rounds in the news quite a bit. That a quarter of American Jews believe Israel is an apartheid state, and 34% think Israel's treatment of Palestinians is akin to anti-black racism in the U.S. And I'll just say that they mention also that, Betty McCollum, the Democratic House rep from Minnesota, has a bill called H.R. 2590, which aims to condition U.S. military aid to Israel. And she says it's currently only backed by 29 other Democrats. So the report, this is Michael Aria at Mondo Weiss. So he's making the point that the American people are getting better on the issue, but it's not exactly catching on. It's not being we're not seeing that change represented in our politics here at home. But I will say this, that she says this is pretty good. She says U.S. assistance intended for Israel's security must never be used to violate the human rights of Palestinian children, demolish the homes of Palestinian families, or to permanently annex Palestinian lands. She said this after introducing the legislation last April. She says peace can only be achieved by respecting human rights, especially the rights of children, and this includes the U.S. taking responsibility for how taxpayer-funded aid is used by recipient countries, Israel included. Congress must stop ignoring the unjust and blatantly cruel mistreatment of Palestinian children and families living under the occupation.
Yeah, I mean, she's one of the best representatives and most outspoken on it. Let's move on and start talking about what's some updates on Afghanistan, where the U.S. troops are out now, Connor. The occupation's over. I'm not quite sure how old you were when it started, but I'm guessing you were a couple years younger than me, so maybe not even in elementary school by the point or something like that. But hey, dude, the troops are out. This is a huge step in the right direction. But that said, it hasn't all been great news. I guess let's start with just kind of what's going on in Afghanistan, then we'll get to Garrett's article. So
Sure.
What's the news from Afghanistan the past couple of days?
Yeah, well, I'll just say for sure. No, it's a huge paradigm shift. No, I mean this. I was like, I want to say 5 when 9/11 happened. So we, virtually since I've been making memories, we've been at war with Afghanistan, and no, it's a huge shift. It's like when you, I don't know how to put it, but it's very interesting to see the way this is all playing out. I've been a little bit, and we're going to get to that with Garrett's piece, disappointed in the media coverage, obviously hugely disappointed in the media coverage, and to see how people have been sort of the polling numbers where people supported the withdrawal, the majority, but then as they kept getting hammered by the media, their support for it started to dwindle a little bit and decrease. And you're just like, I don't know. But no, this is incredible. I mean, hey, one down at least. And so now we can move on to the next ones.
Or if it's like a 3/4 of it, because they're going to keep bombing. Hell, it's still a major step in the right direction. Yeah. So what's happening with the airport now that the U.S. is gone? Are there flights coming in and out? As far as I've seen, there's not. But then I think there's some damage to the airport, and the Taliban. We're talking with Qatar and Turkey about that. So what's happening there?
Yeah, so, on that front, so the Kabul airport lacks air traffic control. This is Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. He says the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration barred U.S. civil aircraft from operating over Afghanistan, citing a lack of control and security concerns. Now, the Americans have frozen billions of dollars in international reserves to Afghanistan, and they've pressured the IMF to I think they were supposed to deliver out of I think it's called the Special Drawing Rights Fund, something like, maybe this number is somewhat off, but I think it was like $450 million or something a couple of weeks ago. This is shortly after the fall of Kabul that they were stopped from doing this. A lot of this is about where you hear from things like where the chief of staff is saying, I don't know if we can recognize them. Are they going to allow freedom of travel? Well, it looks like they're getting ready to do that. The Taliban are in talks with Turkey and Qatar about managing the Kabul airport. I know the Turks have said that they'd like to have some civilian personnel there sort of running the airport there for the Taliban, because I'm sure the people who were running it, I think as you reported on earlier on the show, were likely evacuated. I'm sure I don't know if these people were part of the Afghan, or what division of sort of the Afghan National Army exactly, or who, but these were Afghan government officials who were likely already left the country, so they need somebody to do that. And they're saying the U.S. says there's about 100 to 200 Americans who remain in Afghanistan. Blinken and Biden say they're mostly like dual U.S. Afghan citizens who have lived in Afghanistan for years, and the UN Security Council adopted a resolution on Monday that said they expect the Taliban to allow safe, secure, and orderly departure from Afghanistan of Afghans and all foreign nationals. And I know that a lot of states with America have been putting out these statements saying that the Taliban has, if I'm not mistaken, that the Taliban has said to them that these people will be allowed to leave, like Afghans and foreign nationals who have the proper travel paperwork with another state to leave the country, essentially. And I think this is an indication that they're on the way to making that a possibility for people who want to be able to do it. And I think that's why we're seeing the improvements now at the airport. But that is a thing that we're seeing, like they're going to condition sort of the international recognition of the new government based on things like that. But also they want to make sure that I'm just trying to fix that light. They're trying to also make sure that the as they say, that human rights are upheld, and they're going to talk about, you know, sort of the women's rights and these sorts of things. And we're seeing that, you know, the Taliban have made some promises that they're going to allow women to go to work and I believe be in politics and go to school and these sorts of things. So they're saying it's not the Taliban that we remember from the 90s. But, you know, as Dave DeCamp has pointed out, and he's absolutely right, what is the U.S. going to do if they don't? They're going to impose more sanctions and you know,
not recognize them, because that's kind of the thread I've been seeing, that they're so I think there's one thing that they could probably do that would be a real problem, because of how much money the U.S. has been pouring into Afghanistan and how many probably of the civil programs in that country are built up on U.S. and foreign aid that came into the U.S. government, that there could be some real issues with like tons of people losing jobs, people losing like particular welfare benefits or something like that. I could see that being at least a difficult problem for the Taliban. But at the same time, I don't think that they're at this point, I don't know why the U.S. is trying so hard to withhold the recognition, because I mean, this is the government of Kabul. So what do you think of withholding the recognition?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, the point Dave was making was that if they don't do that and they impose sanctions, the whole idea that this is about human rights or something, well, sanctions only hurt the civilian population. And what are you going to do? You're going to destabilize the country even further, cause an even worse economic crisis? I mean, I'm pretty sure that isn't it like the statistic, I believe, it's like 70% of Afghanis live on like $1 or less than $1 a day. The economic conditions are horrific. The idea that you would even do this is just completely I don't know. It's typical American foreign policy as far as pressuring states and using aggression, economic warfare against them. But I mean, I don't. To your point, I mean, what I'd like to know is like, what kind of concessions are they trying to extract from them exactly? Because I don't think the American government cares at all about human rights. I mean, they may use that PR on the rubes or whatever, but that doesn't seem to be the real concern. We have seen that the Taliban are saying that they want America and other Western states to reopen their embassies in Kabul now that they've left. And they're saying, look, America should have this is Zabihullah Mujahid, who's a sort of top Taliban spokesman. He says America should have only a diplomatic presence in Kabul. We have communication channels with them, and we expect them to reopen their embassy in Kabul, and we want to have trade relations with them. From what I'm seeing as far as the Taliban goes, is that they're looking to trade with these other states, whether it be China or the U.S. They've made some promises to the Russians that they will make sure, and also they've reemphasized to the other regional and neighboring countries that they're going to make sure that there are no attacks launched from Afghan soil against any of these other countries. In fact, a member of Taliban's Cultural Commission was quoted in Tolo News saying, "We promise to the world, regional countries and neighboring countries, Afghanistan soil will not be used against them. The world should recognize the Afghan government and cooperate with us on reconstruction and with investments." And of course, you have Blinken saying that they're going to have to earn that international recognition if they, and as Dave says, they're using all this economic leverage against them. But like as you say, now we're seeing reports that Blinken, that Mark Milley is coming out saying that we may be able to cooperate with them again against ISIS-K. I think they're looking for, as it is indicated in the reports, that as Dave says, that they're looking for a reason to bomb Afghanistan anyway. Biden keeps saying our over the horizon capacity or capabilities are working. We've targeted ISIS-K remotely. You killed civilians. Like the majority of the people you killed were civilians, and they can't prove. Even those reports about the strike in Nangarhar province, there was an exclusive for the Wall Street Journal where they were talking about how, we used this, I think it was called an R9X drone or something. You might have seen this, about how the missile is inert and it shoots out a halo of blades and shreds the target to avoid, too many civilian casualties and really add to increase the precision of a precision strike. And they said that they killed 2 people. The Pentagon came out and said it was or it might have been CENTCOM who said that they got a planner and a facilitator of the attack. But the reports I saw in the Wall Street Journal said that they injured somebody else, and then a total of, I think, 4 additional people, including a woman. They said that they had obtained footage of a house that the side of it had been blown out by this special kind of drone missile, and all kinds of stuff. So it doesn't seem clear to me that either of these strikes were successful. The other one was virtually a massacre of a family, killing 10 civilians, and in Kabul. And, we've had Jen Psaki come out and go, it was a success and this sort of thing. So I don't know if the Taliban necessarily wants to get in on this, whatever it is, because it could cause some blowback for them from the domestic population if they're associated with the right. American former occupying power that's just bombing civilians in the capital city, But as Dave said, they're looking for a reason to do this. But he also makes a point that they can handle ISIS-K on their own, and I think that's basically true. It might be more difficult without the air power, the American air power, but at the same time, I think they can do it, and it's in there. They better be able to do it, because if they don't, they're going to have problems with China and Russia and all these other states to the north who depend on that security. And if they don't, they'll probably have to do it themselves, and the Taliban doesn't want to have to deal with that, whatever that would entail.
I've noticed this hilarious thing in some of the HOTS reporting on this, where they're like, well, we don't know if the Taliban or ISIS-K will end up controlling Kabul. Like, ISIS-K has 1,000 maybe fighters in the country. They're not going to they're no threat to take over the country. They could barely even hold any of their own territory. It's just absurd, but that is something I've been seeing. Now, Connor, let's talk about this Gareth article, because it is very, very important, where he is just kind of explaining how the media coverage of this has started, I think, to really influence the American public perception of ending the Afghan war. So go ahead. Let's talk about Gareth's great article. It's published at the Gray Zone.
Absolutely. So Gareth talks about, he's got a quote, the way he opens this, and Gareth is usually right. I mean, he's one of my favorite reporters, but just the way he said this, it struck me in the beginning. He goes, in the wake of a remarkably successful Taliban offensive capped by the takeover of Kabul, the responses of corporate media provided what may have been the most dramatic demonstration ever of its fealty to the Pentagon and military leadership. And I just mean that one line struck me, because I rarely watch mainstream media, but after the fall of Kabul, I found myself, out of curiosity, flipping on the TV to see what, Fox News, for instance, was doing. And it's just, it was such an intense barrage of propaganda. And really, it's been said by people, especially in the libertarian community, in our world, that they seem to be making this withdrawal, which is ultimately, obviously, a very good thing, as painful as possible in terms of the coverage. And so, he talks about how that one of the things that they've been harping on, and we'll get to some examples, chiefly David Sanger and Helen Cooper in the New York Times, but they're talking about how Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Staff, who, by the way, came out, I neglected to mention, and said, he goes, I think we got one ISIS-K guy in there in that attack in Kabul, which there's absolutely that bombing of those families in Kabul. That there's no evidence of that as of yet, and nothing seems to be pointing in that direction. But he had the nerve to come out and say that. He goes, and others were killed. But anyway, it turns out this guy was making a huge push against Biden to keep 4,500 troops indefinitely in Afghanistan, and it looks like, I mean, again, and this might have been a real reason why Biden, we assumed it was all this pressure from the Pentagon, especially, that it took him so long to make the decision ultimately. It wasn't until I think the middle of April. And so he talks about how they had the media advancing arguments that the military couldn't make themselves, and it gave them cover, especially in the face of such a disastrous failure. So he goes, so the first article that came out as a part of this sort of media attack was from David Sanger and Helen Cooper at the New York Times. And the Beltway, he goes, they begin by acknowledging, yes, the U.S. military overestimated the results of the intervention for years, and yes, the Afghan government's inability to fund their own security forces sapped the will of some of the resistance to the Taliban. However, then they start hammering Biden for his refusal to keep troops indefinitely in the country per Milley's request. And they say that he was trying to get 3,000 to 4,500 troops in the country. And of course, as usual, they cite intelligence estimates that predict that in 2 or 3 years, Al-Qaeda will find a new foothold in Afghanistan. And so, Gareth goes through and very briefly debunks the whole nonsense that you were just actually alluding to earlier. I mean, this stuff about, well, ISIS and the Taliban, maybe ISIS is going to form an alliance with that. All this kind of thing is really part of an extensive history of the Hawks conflating the Taliban with Al-Qaeda and sort of Osama bin Laden, and for the purposes of the war on terror. And there's no truth to it. I mean, I get annoyed when they say they harbored Al-Qaeda. I can't go through all the history right now, but they were in talks with for years after the embassy attacks in East Africa between then and 9/11 with U.S. officials. They even offered to have bin Laden assassinated. They gave him so many chances. I mean, even Milton Bearden, the former CIA station chief in Afghanistan from Operation Cyclone, said that they were giving them all kinds of signals. He's no longer in our supervision. Just basically go out and kill him. They hated him, especially Mullah Omar hated bin Laden. But yeah, we're just seeing more of that. And of course, he also makes a point that they have especially even more of an interest now in ensuring that Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K do not establish any kind of a real presence in Afghanistan, especially, like I just mentioned, they don't want to have any of these issues with China or Russia either, in addition to any sort of potential attack on America and the sort of safe haven myth. But then he says that then they interview David Petraeus, of all people, the great American fraud, as Scott Horton would say. And he says, this is echoing what your coverage of Max Boot. He goes, he says Biden failed to recognize the risk incurred by the swift withdrawal of intelligence drones and close air support, and here you go, the contractors who kept the Afghan Air Force flying. As if this is all of a sudden an issue. Whose fault is this exactly? Because last time I checked, first of all, I don't really – the idea that this is some disaster because there's not going to be some protracted war after we leave where we can continue to fund the Potemkin regime in Kabul in a war with the Taliban there, and they took power in a coup de main with minimal casualties. That's not really a catastrophe as far as I'm concerned. But they're saying that it's too bad that we don't have – they pulled out the contractors, and that was the problem. And they also cite the chief executive of CNAS, who says roughly the same thing, this guy Richard Fontaine. And CNAS, of course, is behind the Afghan surge. Michelle Floor and I founded the think tank, and we're going to get to her in a minute too. But they're basically saying that it's Biden's fault that this all happened because he pulled the contractors out. Well, the contractors wouldn't be necessary if Congress didn't step in, I believe, during the Trump administration and say that the Afghan government had to buy American helicopters and Black Hawk helicopters because they can't be buying the old Soviet helicopters, which they were able to maintain themselves. They had to get these helicopters, which are not nearly as capable, and as soon as we started pulling out on any real level after May 1st, most of these helicopters were grounded, and the Afghan government wasn't able to provide air support to their commandos, and reinforcements never came that were promised to these guys in the field. And oftentimes, like I said, there were minimal casualties, but there were instances where in these commandos who were defending districts who thought that reinforcements were coming, they were just, sometimes half of them would be slaughtered by the Taliban, and then the rest of them would give up because they'd realize that, that you can't count on anything here. And so, then he talks about how in foreign policy, they interviewed a bunch of people on August 16th. So this is after Kabul fell. He says they interviewed a bunch of foreign and current diplomats who said, we are just they anonymously said, deep anger, shock, and bitterness is how we feel about the collapse of the government we spent decades trying to build, which is just laughable. $20 trillion, hundreds of thousands of people killed, and the thing collapsed in 11 days. And but you're really sad. I'm sorry to hear that. All the hard work. And they say that the current people were threatening that they would resign in protest, citing an overwhelming sense of guilt and fear for the lives of their former Afghan colleagues and local staff whom the American government is leaving behind. And, of course, we heard about this constantly in different iterations throughout the media, and even the independent media, especially on the right. You heard a lot of people, just basically attacking Biden for leaving, our allies behind and all this kind of thing. And then Robin Wright at the New Yorker, this is pretty good. She says that this is a dishonorable, she's complaining that our standing is being lessened in the world and that this is dishonorable. And she laments that the U.S. is engaged in what historians may someday call a great retreat from a ragtag army that has no air power. But it's like, how do you not even realize when you're writing that this was a totally wrong, this was the worst policy is, like you said, I mean, this is bin Laden's policy. It bogs us down in a quagmire. We can't win, and we just bleed ourselves to bankruptcy. This is more than $2 trillion. We've reordered our entire society, and we're trillions of dollars in debt. We have all this mass surveillance, torture prisons, including in Afghanistan during the war. And the idea that they would say that we did. We lost to the Taliban. We lost to the Pashtuns. And the idea that this is where I'm supposed, I always feel like they're trying to I guess this is meant for more the intellectual class and the politicians and the so-called thought leaders or whatever. But I do feel like if you look at the mainstream news, they kind of do the same thing to the American people who rightfully so have this Afghanistan syndrome, as it's being called. But they're being bullied into, you should feel weak and pathetic and shameful of all of this, for not supporting and continuing the policies. She goes, this is part of an unnerving American pattern dating back to the 70s. And again, that would be the Vietnam syndrome. She goes, it starts with Reagan's pullout from Beirut and Obama's withdrawal from Iraq in 2011. And she claimed the Taliban has won a key battle against democracy in Afghanistan, and the country will almost certainly become a safe haven for like-minded militants, be they members of Al-Qaeda or others in search of a sponsor. Of course, leaning on that old propaganda I'd referenced earlier.
Right. Hilarious when there was no democracy in Afghanistan. Fake elections are not elections. If they thought democracy was under attack in America, at least a good number of the eligible voters showed up to vote, and polling sites weren't blown up on the day, and Trump didn't swear himself in at the same time as the president like we had in Afghanistan. But what else is in this Gareth article?
Oh yeah, so he talks about how there was this PBS panel, let's see, on Washington Week with Peter Baker of the New York Times, Ann Giran of the Washington Post, and Vivian Salma of the Wall Street Journal. And he says that they basically blame all the chaos at Kabul airport and all the Afghans seeking escape and the chaos that ensued as basically blaming Biden for the hasty withdrawal and this sort of thing. And Gareth makes the point that and I thought this was good. He goes, the implicit and clearly fanciful premise of the discussion was that the United States could have somehow embarked weeks or months earlier on a sweeping program to rescue tens and possibly hundreds of thousands of interpreters and other collaborators with the U.S. military, and that it could all be done cleanly and efficiently without triggering any panic. How do you do that? You tell all these people that essentially, like, you got to get out of here because you all might die, but keep it on the DL, would you? Because we don't want to, how would you organize something like that? But Yeah, no, I mean they're just again, like I said, I think it's more about bullying the American people. They could have as Doug Bondo talks about, they could have expedited and fixed the visa process that was broken. And they obviously should have gotten started on this as soon as he came into office. But again, these people are running cover and carrying water for the military who were trying to sabotage this all along during both administrations. And he says, Peter Baker of the New York Times, this is really shameful. The guy says, well, Biden made up his mind a decade ago that the U.S. must withdraw from Afghanistan. He was determined to do it, regardless of what General Milley and others warned him about the danger of a collapse. So then the worst example is they interviewed Michelle Flournoy, who should not be asked about what she thinks about anything, but is unfortunately a very powerful foreign policy apparatchik, especially given her history in the Obama administration and sort of in the Democratic Party's foreign policy establishment. I would characterize her as a neocon, although ideologically she might not fill every box. But this is a woman who has suggested that we should let's put it this way, her think tank CEO formerly was Victoria Nuland. And she has said that we need to be able to destroy the entire Chinese civilian merchant military fleet in 72 hours in the event of a war with them. And so she, has her name. She has her byline over the disastrous Afghan surge that tripled the war and killed tens of thousands of people and only made the Taliban stronger. And she came out, and this guy, Greg Jaff in the Washington Post, interviews her, and she says, basically he admits, he acknowledges that the war was, as Garrett says, an abject failure. But he interviews her for her, her perspective. And she comes out and she says essentially the problem with the whole mission, and that she wasn't aware of this until after the surge, was that it turns out the Afghan government was corrupt. The people that we empowered, the warlords, they were just unreliable. And what she say? Our democratic ideals were not sustainable or workable in the Afghan context, sort of blaming the Afghan people, but saying that, we had a big bet. We had made a big bet only to learn that our local partner was rotten. And basically saying that, our liberal democratic ways are just not workable in a backwards place like Afghanistan. And we just didn't realize that the people that we had empowered, people like Rashid Dostum, were, corrupt. And, a guy who murders people in shipping containers has been a war criminal general for decades. Yeah, who would have known that? But this is the guy that we allied with immediately after we went into Afghanistan in the beginning of 2001. And so, Gareth points out that that's just simply not true. So Amnesty International was documenting as early as 2003 that the warlord militiamen who we had empowered as police in places around Afghanistan in these different provinces were extorting money from local families by abducting and raping their wives, daughters, and sons. He says, that these militia police they maintained their loyalty to the warlords, and were not loyal to any civilian government Kabul. They were given a free hand to steal from Afghans, falsely accuse them of crimes, and torture them, and then release them only for a ransom. And he gives an example of how in Helmand province in 2005-2006, the Taliban took over and had popular support because the people were sick of these warlord militias out, killing people and torturing people. And when the Americans came back in 2009, they came back and they reoccupied these areas. They essentially, from large parts of Helmand province, I should say, they came back and they occupied those areas again and re-empowered those militias. And immediately they went back to raping preteen boys and committing all kinds of atrocities. And so the Afghan population of Helmand province in these parts were telling the Americans that you better stop or we're going to start supporting the Taliban. But of course, the Americans never did that. They never dropped their alliance with these kinds of murderers and war criminals. And so, again, this was all on record, as anybody who was reading antiwar.com would have known, that any good reporting at the time, that these people, you did not have popular support. And it's very obvious. I mean, the whole thing went down literally like a house of cards. And but yeah, no, Michelle Flournoy wants us to believe that the problem is that the Afghan people just don't have the democracy in them to see the job through.
All right, Connor, I guess that's where we should wrap up here. Thank you so much for coming back on the show and talking about all this important stuff today. We will do it again soon. Everybody, keep an eye on the featured articles section at the Libertarian Institute. If Connor does any more articles coming up, they will be there. And follow him on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96. I got that right this time?
Absolutely.
All right, thanks
again,
Connor.
See you soon.